Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about subsistence spaces, or sometimes it's called subsistence patterns, subsistence strategy, whatever. But nonetheless, talking about subsistence, it is how individuals extract calories from the environment, how they feed themselves, how they make a living. And as your book explores as well, it's something that is going to profoundly shape a culture and society, from their religion and their social structure to their kinship to their you name it, even things like behavior. So it's a big part of understanding culture. And we're also going to talk about this in a more broad sense of how it links into economic anthropology. Okay, so the three components to an economic system, to any economic system, is production, consumption, and exchange. And historically, that's what economists tended to focus on, right? Making stuff, using stuff, trading stuff, right? For anthropology, we tend to focus on the meaning and symbolism behind those things. We want to understand production, consumption, and exchange. But we want to understand why those things are important to individuals in a more symbolic way, in a more meaningful way, how we ascribe certain things, right? So, for example, right now, I am sitting at my table, and I actually built this table myself. I built my dining room table, I built the bench that goes with it, I built my bookcases. In truth, I probably could have bought a table for cheaper than what I built this, but the production of it, the making of it, has more meaning for me than just the table in and of itself, right? It goes beyond simply a utilitarian purpose, right? I don't even remember what I spent on wood and glue and everything else, but the truth is, I could probably have bought a table cheaper. But for me, it's really meaningful that when people come over, I say, yeah, that's my table. Like, I designed it, I built it, I made that myself, There's meaning behind that, right? There's a symbol behind that, that goes well beyond its thing, right? To give you another example, when we're talking about consumption, look at the way that we become quite brand loyal. Look at I joke around a lot about the cult of Apple, right? People absolutely love their iPhones, they love their MacBooks, they love their Apple Watch and all of that kind of stuff. Even though this is $1 trillion corporation, they don't know us personally, they don't care about us, but we're quite loyal. There is some symbolic importance behind having an iPhone in our culture, as opposed to just any other phone, which also will call and text and let you, surf Reddit or, whatever. And so it's about more than that, right? So those kinds of things is just a couple of quick examples of what I mean when I say that we focus on that meaning and symbolism, okay? And again, this does all kind of fit into a broader sense about the economy. And as I say here, other than biological reproduction, economic activity is one of the most influential interactions that we have. But I'd also argue that that's on a societal level as well, in terms of economic activity, as I said before, really shapes who we are, right? And one of the failures then is that in classical economics, economic theories, economic activities, ideas, this kind of stuff is often taken out of the context in which it's taking place in. And instead we want to talk about it being sort of universal or natural, right? That people are naturally X, they're naturally selfish, or they're naturally, capitalistic, or these kinds of things. The truth is, all of this activity takes place within a historic and cultural framework, that it is deeply embedded in a great many other things, and that it is situated in both time and place, the environment in which it is found, those kinds of things. So as I said, economics is a cultural system, right? We often talk about capitalism as a cultural system. But one, we often will try to claim that sort of capitalism is somehow inherent to humans. But as I've mentioned before, it's like 300 years old, so I doubt that very much. But capitalism is more than just our economic system. Capitalism is the way that we approach a great many things in our life. So, for example, the foundation of capitalism, as it is expressed in the Western world, is private property and personal ownership, right? That is tantamount to what capitalism is. But it's more than just about economics there, right? So, for example, if I needed a pen and we were sitting in the classroom together, I can't just go in your backpack and get a pen out. That's private property, it's personal ownership, that's your pen. Even though economically you probably don't care about that pen, it was 49 cents. You know, if I needed it, you'd probably give me a pen. Like, yeah, dude, just keep it. Don't worry about it, Josh. You know, but that's not the point, right? Whereas for someone like, say, the Kungsan in the Kalahari Desert as a people, they don't understand what private property and personal ownership is. If you need something, you just take it from somebody. And if they need it back, they'll take it from you, right? Among the Kung, they have a saying that is only lions don't share, meaning that to be human is to share, right? That's very much different than what we think of in the world today, right? So this is a cultural ideology as much as it is anything else, okay? So today, let's talk about these subsistence patterns, and there's four that we really explore. Some people argue that there ought to be a fifth, which we can talk about, but really these are the four that we talk about. To let you know, these things go in the order that they do for two reasons. One, this is actually the development over time. So this is kind of a timeline. Human beings started as foragers, moved into horticulture with the Neolithic Revolution, pastoralism, and ultimately agriculture. It also functions as a kind of scale. This goes from the most sustainable to the least sustainable, right? From foraging, which makes the most extensive use of the environment, that is the most sustainable system, all the way up to agriculture, which makes the most intensive use of the environment, as opposed to extensive, and it is the least sustainable. And as I'll talk a little bit about today, it ain't sustainable, especially the way that we have structured it in the modern world. So we've been talking about foraging here for a little while now, and different things. Foraging is extracting calories from the natural environment, from wild sources, be they wild plants, wild animals, wild fish, scavenging, you name it, right? As I said before, we used to call this hunting and gathering, but foraging is a little more reflective of the diversity of activities that we see in people. Foraging as a way of life is going away, to be honest. There's only about 750,000 foragers left in the world, and I do find that to be very sad. And some people say, you know, why does it matter? Well, to comment on that, one, I think it matters because any time that we lose the behavior or practices of a group of people, we are all worse for it. You know, I think that having more answers, more behavior, more diversity, more pluralism in the human experience is a plus. I would often compare it to, say, artistic expression. You know, I might not be a big fan of, say, country music, but I'm glad that it's out there, influencing other genres of music, expressing different ideas in different ways. I might not be a fan of horror movies, right? But I'm glad that it's out there, again, influencing other films, filmmakers, writers, being in a dialogue, offering something to people that maybe other genres of film don't. You could say the same thing about novels. You could say the same thing about dance. You could say the same thing about anything, right? The more diverse the human voice is, then ultimately the more inclusive that it is, the more that it represents our collective experience. And so I don't like to see us lose anything like that. I'd also argue foragers are incredibly intelligent. That's something I want to emphasize in all of these subsistence modes, is the intelligence and adaptive nature of all these people. Foragers have a tremendous amount of knowledge about the natural environment. I've touched on that with you guys before, about things like wild plants that are used for medicine. 25% of all drugs on the market today, medical drugs, come from sort of wild plants around the globe, where you know, ethnobotanists and anthropologists like myself, working with indigenous communities, talk to them about what do you use for this? What do you use this plant for? How do you treat this symptom? And then us taking that back to a lab and examining what kind of compounds are in there that that help us, right? There's also more and more evidence of some of the other knowledge that they have about the natural environment, about animal behavior, about the interconnectedness of ecological systems, and these kinds of things. So I think that there's not just philosophically, but tangible reasons why, you know, we should keep this, why we need this, right? And how it frankly benefits all of us, right? But this is, as I said before, the most sustainable adaptation. This extensive use of the environment, it will have a huge impact on how a society is shaped, how a culture is shaped. You're going to have, as I've said before, you're going to be nomadic or semi-nomadic. You are going to have smaller populations, limited material culture. You're not going to have a formal leadership system with foragers because it's not necessary, right? You're going to have social egalitarianism, more or less. You're not going to really have a lot of hierarchy, stuff like that. So, doing this is something that is going to shape us profoundly. Now, I just wanted to mention really quick here the forager diet. As you guys know, I kind of enjoy sort of dispelling, you know, myths and misconceptions that people have when it comes to anthropological information. Some of the most popular diets recently have been things like the paleo diet or no carb or slow carb or keto or things like that. Many of which emphasize like meat, like fat and protein over either carbohydrates or plant materials or things like that. Now, I'm not a nutritionist, so I'm not telling you what's healthy, and I don't really know. This is not my area of expertise. But many of those diets actually claim, well, this is a healthy way to eat because this is how your ancestors ate. Well, that's a little bit of a different claim than saying this is healthy. Saying, well, this is how you're supposed to eat because this is how foragers ate for, 190,000 years. That doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. Just to let you know, when you look at the vast majority of hunter-gatherers and foragers around the globe, most of their food is coming from plants, right? The FA in Central Africa, where more than 90% is coming from plants. The Kung or San in the Kalahari Desert, who I mentioned before, that have about 85% of their caloric intake coming from plants. The reality is that traditionally, okay, the forager diet is very high on plant material and fairly low on protein and fat. Now, again, I'm not a nutritionist. If you say, well, yeah, but we should eat this way or whatever, that's fine. That's fine. If you want to say something's healthier, ask a nutritionist. I have no idea. But the idea that it's the way people have been eating is a little bit silly. The same is true for things like gluten. Pretty much all forager peoples that have any kind of availability of like wheat or something like that, wild cereal grains in their environment, we've been eating that for many, many, many millennia. So we always have, so that's always been a part of our diet too. So a lot of those claims just don't really hold up to actual scrutiny. So let's talk about horticulture a little bit. As I had mentioned before, as we discussed, horticulture is something that comes in with the Neolithic Revolution. It's when we start farming, right? It's when we settle down into villages, right? This is a photograph that I took actually during my field work in Zambia. And this is a small village that I did interviews in. The little sort of round thatched rooms that you see there that don't have roofs on them, that's actually like a place where they store like grain and stuff like that. Horticulture is farming with only the use of human power, right? So no draft animals, no plow animals, no tractors, no irrigation pumps, no nothing like that. Okay. So this is only human power that we're using. A lot of people would call this like intensive gardening, right? Or subsistence gardening, or, something like that. There's a lot of different versions of horticulture out there, slash and burn or pioneer or this kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, what's important is that it is strictly about making a living with your own sweat. It's your own hard work, right? So this is plants and animals and these kinds of things. Again, horticultural people are incredibly brilliant and have had really fascinating adaptations to their environment, and have a real deep understanding of the plants and animals that they work with and these kinds of things. And again, I argue that there's a lot that we could learn from these people. So for just to give you some examples, more and more today we're talking about whether or not traditional horticulturalists might offer us some help when it comes to dealing with global climate change. In the Western world with agriculture today, which we'll talk about, we've become really dependent on just a few crops. Whereas for, most peoples, they actually have a diversity of crops because they know that it is an insurance policy. We grow, just to use an example, potatoes. We grow 2, 3, 4, 5 varieties of potatoes typically in the United States, right? If you go down to Publix, you're going to see like 3, like a russet potato, Yukon Gold, and then they got some like weird purple one or something, right? When I was in Peru, going to the marketplace there, I was blown away by the number of potatoes that I saw. The potatoes were domesticated in the Andes, and they have more than 1,000 varieties there. For example, one that I saw, like people were telling me, like, yeah, when we want like a buttery potato, we don't just butter a potato. We actually have a variety that we grow that is more buttery in flavor. And so it's really amazing, right? And the reason for this is because they've adapted to their environment. In the Andes, of course, it's a very steep mountain range, and it's not like you can plant a big field like you can here. And so typically what happens is you have what we call verticality, and verticality is just that going up the mountainside, I might have a little piece of land here that I can work, and then higher up, and then higher up, and then higher up, and then all of these little plots, though, they're going to have different microclimates because you go 1,000 feet up in elevation, you're talking about a totally different soil profile, different rainfall, different temperatures, things like that. And so they've adapted these different crops to live in these different environments. And what we're starting to see more and more is that some of these crops are better suited to some of the changes that we see taking place with global warming, right? When I was working in Oaxaca, Mexico, for example, the group that I worked with was called Cintiol, and they were actually encouraging peoples to try to start growing an indigenous kind of sorghum that was from that region that horticulturalists have been growing for, millennia before the Spanish came. And, excuse me. It was ultimately replaced by corn in the modern era, but this indigenous sorghum that they're growing actually has significantly higher rates of like protein and other micronutrients, and it requires something like 1/10 or 1/5 of the water that corn does, and so it's much better adapted to an arid environment or to fluctuations in rainfall or things like that we're facing right now, right? So horticulturalists have an incredible amount of knowledge and an incredible amount to offer us. As I said, if you remember from our discussions before, with horticulture, though, is where you're going to start seeing the rise of things like hierarchy, political organization, greater social organizational complexity, changes in kinship. This is where you get the idea of land, right? And land ownership. Foragers don't really have the idea of land ownership. They don't do that, right? So horticulturalists are settled, right? And so they're going to start to understand or accept an idea about owning the land around them. The third one that I want to talk about is pastoralism. Pastoralism is making a living by herding animals, right? Herd, not hurting, herding animals, right? So this can be cows, this can be goats, this can be sheep, this can be camels, this can be whatever, right? A lot of times people are going to have more than one variety of animals that they herd, although pretty much everybody focuses on one as like the sort of most important, right? Again, pastoralism is a genius adaptation of the environment. What we find is pastoral groups typically are living in ecological zones where other things aren't available to you. So there's not enough plants or animals in this environment for you to eat, right? The environment wouldn't really support farming or gardening or horticulture. And so what these people have done is they've taken an animal and they use it as a calorie filter of, look, everything out here is too scrubby, too thorny, whatever. I can't eat it, but cows can, and I can eat the cows. Goats can, and I can eat those, right? And so, excuse me, it's a really pretty awesome adaptation. There are still a lot of pastoralists around the globe, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Pastoral groups are often very militaristic. And the reason why is because, as you might imagine, having a large herd of animals means that I need to move them around all the time. I can't just hang out on this one piece of grass because my cows are going to eat that, quite quickly. And so people have to move around. Well, if you're one of those horticulturalists that we were just talking about, and you see me come over the hill with 500 cows, you're looking at your, cornfield and going, I don't want this guy coming anywhere near this. These cows are going to decimate me, right? And so having to move a lot puts pastoralists in contact with a lot of other groups, and it can ultimately lead to a lot of conflict. Now, some anthropologists and some anthropological textbooks will claim that pastoralists are the most militaristic of all groups. I don't know that I buy that, because I think that is rather problematic. Like, no offense, but pastoralists have never committed a genocide that I'm aware of, whereas industrialized societies have committed so many genocides. We had to set like a minimum benchmark of how many people did you murder before it counts as a genocide. So pastoralists never, carpet bombed London during the Blitzkrieg. So, but they are very warrior-like. They are very militaristic. There's no doubt about that. But that's also going to be culturally mediated, because if you're a pastoralist, you're moving around all the time, you're not putting down roots. Pastoralists very rarely have things like metalworking or other smithing. Pastoralists don't really have a lot of crops. Some do. Some are able to stay in one place long enough that they do have like a growing season, but many don't. And so they're going to have to sort of make friends with their neighbors, because otherwise they're, they don't have access to, corn or wheat or pumpkins or metal spear points or those kinds of things. So that is going to be mediated through some different things. Pastoralists, again, are really brilliant adapters to their environment. These animals supply milk, they supply meat, they supply leather, and they supply blood. Okay, and so to talk about the genius of this system, I want to mention one thing, which is the Maasai. The Maasai are a group in East Africa. You've probably seen them on National Geographic. The men are very tall, very lean. They wear red. They put like red clay in their hair. They carry spears, this kind of stuff. My mentor, Stuart McRae, lived with the Maasai in Kenya for a year. That's where he did his field work. The Maasai don't really eat their cows very often. They do, but not a lot. Most of the time, they are subsisting on milk and blood. And what they'll do is this spear that they always carry, they'll take just the tip, and they'll poke it into the side of the cow, into its like shoulder. and they'll drain some of the blood, and then they'll rub like mud and grass on the hole, and the cow's okay, right? And then they take that blood and they drink it, or they mix it with milk and drink it. Now that seems kind of weird to us because they're like, well, why wouldn't you just eat the cow? Like, it's right there, eat the cow. They're very intelligent and they know why they do this. They can explain it, and they explain it quite well. The truth is, where they live in Africa is very arid, and it has a drought cycle. Every 10 to 15 years, they have a really serious drought, right? That is just the ecology of the region. And so every 10 to 15 years, this serious drought's going to come through there, and it usually will decimate their herds. I mean, they can lose like 90% of their herds or something. Well, here's the thing. If I have 10 cows and I lose 90%, I'm left with one. I can't rebuild a herd with one cow. But if I have 500 cows and I lose 90%, I'm left with 50. I can rebuild a herd with 50 cows. That's doable, right? But if I'm spending my time killing these cows and eating them, my herd's never going to be big enough to withstand that drought cycle. And they know that. And so they say, yeah, you got to keep this going, right? You got to keep the numbers up, or else you're going to run into a problem, And so, so they typically don't eat them. They do some, but not a lot. Also, I mean, they're nomadic pastoralists. If you slaughter a cow, you get, I don't even know, 300, 400, 500 pounds of meat. What are you going to do with that? They don't have electricity. They don't have refrigeration. They don't have a deep freezer. What do you do with that much food? Right. So, so it is a really smart way to kind of adapt to these things. Okay. And lastly, I want to talk about agriculture here. Agriculture is farming, but it is farming with the use of more than human power. So again, this is where we'll get draft animals, we'll get tractors, we'll get irrigation pumps, we'll get whatever, right? So more than just you working your tail off, right? A lot of people argue that agriculture is too broad of a category, that we really need to divide it into a couple of different groups, because there's a huge difference between simple agriculture and industrialized agriculture. So, I mean, it's one thing to talk about, yes, these people are doing agriculture because maybe they have a water pump that will flood a rice field. That's very, very different than what you and I are doing, where, we have tractors and combines that are controlled by satellite GPS computers that actually can and do drive themselves, farming thousands of acres of monocrop agriculture, which are genetically modified organisms and things like that, where we're using planes to fly over and spray pesticides. I mean, excuse me. There's a huge difference here, right? And so a lot of us are arguing that maybe we ought to think about it differently. As I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, agriculture is the least sustainable of these things. Now, that might sound silly because you're like, look at how awesome we are, Josh. Like, we're pretty badass. How can you say it's not sustainable? Well, because it isn't. Because agriculture, as it's practiced now, requires a tremendous amount of inputs, what's called ag inputs. This includes water, this includes fertilizer, pesticides, herbicides, things like that. The truth is, our model of agriculture is dependent on oil, either in the form of petrochemical fertilizers that are added to it, right? Or in the form of transportation or refrigeration or things like that. In the United States, the average thing that we eat has to travel 1,300 miles from where it was produced to where it's consumed on our plate. Because most of us live in cities now. We don't live on farms. And so that's a tremendous amount of oil that has to be used to transport the food from where it starts to where it ends. And again, Democrat, Republican, left, right, center, it doesn't matter. All of us know, all of us agree, we will run out of oil. Oil is a finite resource, right? Ask an economist. That's why oil is valuable, right? Scarcity creates value. If it was an unlimited source, oil wouldn't be worth anything. It's not. That's why it's worth something, right? So, what do we do when we don't have as much oil? What do we do when oil doubles, triples, quadruples in price? How will that affect the cost of food moving it 1,300 miles? How will that affect refrigeration of that food? Which is going to be dependent again on oil or coal or different things like that to generate the electricity to keep that food from spoiling so that it can move from Kansas, or Idaho, or California all the way to Florida, right? Again, California, the Central Valley in California produces something like 1/5 of all of the produce that's eaten in the United States. So that's a lot of movement from California to Maine to Florida to New York to, all these places. So this is not a sustainable system. And we really need to start having a conversation about how we're going to rethink agricultural production, and how we're going to rethink those three components of the economic system that I was talking about of production, consumption, and exchange, right? I talked about reciprocity before, and this kind of comes in there, and we had discussed the Kula Ring and the Trobriand Islands just a little bit, again, about this concept that goods, services, supply, demand, production, consumption, exchange, it's about more than the object. It's about the relationships that are built. It's about the ideology behind it. It's about the symbolism behind it. It's about all of these things, okay? I want to speak really briefly about the tragedy of the commons here, which is an article that was written in the 1960s by a guy named Hardin. This is a idea and a paper that has been wildly influential on both economics and agricultural studies, and it has some pretty serious flaws to it. The idea of the tragedy of the commons, in this case, they're using commons in the old school British sense, which is like commonly held land or communal land, right? So in the middle of town, there's a big field and all of us are allowed to graze our livestock on it, right? We still kind of have this at like universities and colleges when we talk about the commons, like lounge areas in the middle of the building where students can sort of hang out, study, drink a coffee. Those are usually called commons. And so it's the same kind of concept. Hardin argues some interesting things in this paper, and some of it's kind of weird. He's actually arguing against welfare and social services, which is a whole different thing that we don't have time for. But what he says is that he uses an example of agriculture as to basically why welfare is bad, capitalism is best, these kinds of things. And I'm simplifying his argument here. But what he says is take, for example, the commons, right? This idea of land that is used by everybody. And he said, if we all put just a few animals on that land, right, then everybody comes out ahead and it's fine. He said, but people are inherently greedy. And so people are going to put too many animals on there because somebody's going to want to get rich. So instead of putting 3 or 4 or 5 sheep, they're going to put 30. And then other people are going to go, well, screw that guy. I want to be rich too. I'll put 30 on there. And what's going to end up happening is we're all going to put too many animals on there and we're going to destroy the land and it's going to hurt all of us. And his argument is because we don't own that land, it's communal. We don't feel any responsibility to that land. Well, there's a lot of failures in his argument, right? One is that, in fact, we do see that people recognize it is better for me, even though I don't own that land, I use that land, and if I don't take care of that land, the things I do own, my sheep, will die. But what he also leaves out, because he's kind of an armchair scholar here, he's not out doing field research, is that cultures throughout the globe actually have mechanisms in place so that this does not happen. So, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, where I've worked, people have been grazing grazing animals on communal land for millennia. I'm talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And guess what? The land did not get overplayed. It did not turn into a tragedy. Why? Because they recognized the value of living in a more harmonious situation with their environment, with their neighbors, with their subsistence, right? As I said, there's also oftentimes things put in place. So to give you an example, that's not grazing, but it is about communal land. When I was working in Eswatini, I was doing interviews with people, and I may have mentioned this before. I was doing interviews with people about what wild plants they use. And, they would list a plant, tell me what they use it for, these kinds of things. And I got to know a lot of the plants really, really well just because people would tell me the same plants over and over again. And so one time I was doing an interview with a woman and she listed a couple of tree species. And I said, you use those for firewood, right? Because I knew that that's what people use that wood for. And she said, it's firewood, but I don't use it. And I was like, okay, well, some people in Eswatini, there's a lot of differences in people's lives. And so some people actually do not have electricity at all, and they're just cooking on fires. Others have electricity and they have an oven or a stove. And so she said, yeah, that's firewood, but I don't use it. I said, oh, okay. I said, do you have a stove? And she says, no, I don't have electricity. I cook on a fire. And I was like, oh, okay. So those two woods you mentioned, those are firewoods. And she said, yeah. I said, and you use those? And she says, no. I was really confused. And I said, well, why not? She said, well, I'm not allowed. It turns out that each group in Eswatini traditionally, based on your clan affiliation, there are certain woods that you're allowed to gather and certain woods that you're not. And so if you're, say, Glamini clan, you can gather like these 3 trees, but no one else can. Or if you're Pendile, you can gather these other different kinds of tree plants. What this means is that on this communally owned forest that you and I are gathering firewood from, me and you and all the other tribes are able to coexist in this place peacefully because none of us are going to overplay those resources. There's certain things I can use, there's certain things you can use, and there are taboos against us using each other's, right? So there's always these sort of cultural mechanisms that are in place. And so while you hear about the tragedy of the commons, when it comes to agriculture and subsistence and this kinds of things, there's a lot of kind of big failures in this argument. This also gets into foodways, right? What we eat, right, is again about more than just economics. It goes back to, this is about consumption, this is about production, this is about exchange, and it goes back to that idea of symbolism and meaning. And so, all of us at the end of November will probably be sitting down to a table that looks a lot like the one on your left there, of turkey and pumpkin pie and stuffing and cranberry sauce and, green bean casserole and all of this kind of stuff, right? There's a lot of symbolism behind this. So for example, like I for years and years and years, almost all of my life, I made green bean casserole every year. I hate green beans. It's like the one thing that I don't particularly like. I hate green beans. I never eat them. And yet every year I would make a green bean casserole. Why? I don't know. My mama made it when I was a kid, and my cousins made it, and you make it. It's Thanksgiving. That's what you do. You make green bean casserole, right? So even though I didn't like it, there was a symbolic meaning behind it, right? Some of my research now on hunting and urban-based hunters and stuff like that is a good example of many of the things that we're talking about with subsistence, right? These are individuals that work jobs and live in town and that kind of stuff. They live in a city. They could go down to Publix and buy meat. And frankly, they could go buy meat for cheaper than what it costs them to hunt it, right? To buy a gun, to get a license, to get tags, to get a hunting lease, to get camo, to get ammo, to get a tree stand, to get a 4-wheeler, to get all of this kind of stuff. It'd just be cheaper to go down to Publix and buy meat. So why do they do it? Well, from a production standpoint, there is great meaning in the idea of I made this happen. I didn't just go buy this meat. I harvested this animal, and that's why it's important. To talk about exchange a little bit too. One of the things that I find is that people often will hunt, and they are, despite the high cost associated with that meat, they're much more likely to share that meat. They're much more likely to give it to family and friends. They're much more likely to cook it when people are coming over, because part of the importance of those calories is the exchange of it, is the sharing of it, is the community that it builds, right? The symbolism and the meaning behind it, right? So let's talk about GMOs for just a second. We've talked about this a little bit more before. If you're unaware, GMOs are genetically modified organisms, right? And I want to bring this up because, again, we were talking about the sustainability issue and the ideas surrounding industrialized agriculture. So I want to kind of hit on some different myths or ideas or things like that. One thing that you hear a lot of people say, including Neil deGrasse Tyson, the great scientist, is that GMOs are not new, that GMOs are no different than domestication because genetically modified organisms, right, and domestication are the same thing, many argue, right? Domestication is just modifying an organism. It is selective breeding as opposed to natural selection. It's artificial selection. This is selective breeding of traits that I want in an organism, whether it be that it goes from having a thin strand of kernels like the teosintine that you see on the left there, to having lots and lots of kernels, which is what we get modern corn out of, or that it is the bigger fruit or more milk production or whatever it is that we want out of this organism. Right? That is what we did with domestication. That is absolutely true. I also think it's a little bit naive to say that domestication and GMOs today are the same thing. There's a big difference between saying, listen, this pumpkin is huge, so I'm going to plant those seeds so that I can grow more big-ass pumpkins. That's very different than saying, in a laboratory, we have now taken pesticides and spliced it into the genomic structure of this corn so that we don't have to spray it with pesticides. That's a very different thing, to literally modify the DNA of a plant as opposed to just picking and choosing what we want to do. There's a lot of backlash against GMOs, some of which is founded, some of which is not. One of the things that I want to point out is that there is no study out there that has found that GMOs have a negative impact on human health, at least directly. However, there's a lot that find that they have a negative impact on the environment, which does then indirectly have an impact on human health, right? Now, before we get all, fired up and say that we need to ban GMOs, let me say this. One, I don't particularly like GMOs. I try not to eat them. I don't buy them. But that's a very first world luxury, okay? I have a good job. I have a decent income. I have the option of not buying GMOs. The truth is GMOs are how we feed the world now that we have more than 7 billion people. If we got rid of GMOs tomorrow, we would see about half the world population starve to death, right? The truth is the amount of yield, right, that you get from GMOs is so astronomically high. We just couldn't feed ourselves without them anymore. And so, yes, I don't really like GMOs. I confess that. But I also have the luxury to not like GMOs. And if you are living in poverty in the developing world, that may not be an option for you. And so I'm a little uncomfortable when I hear, frankly, rich Westerners saying that nobody should eat GMOs. I try not to eat GMOs, but again, that's a luxury. Yeah. And there are some very serious social implications because of GMOs. There's been a problem in India with suicides from this. One of the things about a GMO is I'm a seed company and I'm making this seed and I'm selling it to you. But there's a problem with selling seeds. As all farmers know, well, from my standpoint as a seed company, there's a benefit if you're a farmer. If you're a farmer, all farmers, my grandfather was a farmer, by the way. When you harvest your crops, you're going to keep a certain percentage of them back as seeds, right? And so one of the upsides of farming is that you always feed yourself, right? You may not be rich, but you can always feed yourself, globally speaking, right? And so whenever you harvest, you're going to keep, whatever percentage back so that you can plant those as seeds next year. It's kind of a self-fulfilling thing. Well, that's a problem for me if I'm a seed company because then I can only sell seeds to you one time. So what seed companies have done is that these genetically modified organisms that produce way higher yield or are more drought resistant or more bug resistant or more, whatever, they've genetically modified them so that they cannot self-germinate, right? The seeds are sterile. You can't do it. So that every year you have to come back to me and buy more. The problem is that then what happens if the crops fail? So you came and bought seeds from me this year. And the truth is for almost all farmers, you buy everything on credit. And then at the end of the year, when you sell your harvest, you pay off all of your debts. Well, if your crops fail, you can't pay off your debts, which means that you can't buy more seed from me next year, and the seeds that you have won't grow, right? In India, this has led to a rash of suicides because traditionally, in a lot of states in India, widows and orphans were taken care of. And so many farmers have gotten into a situation where they bought GMOs, or GMs as they're often called there, genetically modified. And when the crops failed, or the rains didn't come, or there was a pestilence or a whatever, right? They've realized, my family is going to starve to death. But if I kill myself, the state will step in and at least take care of them, and so my family gets to live. And so, they have had hundreds of thousands of suicides in the country because of this, right? So there are some very serious social implications, right? And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Some of you are familiar with Monsantos and other corporations and how some of their terrible social practices, right? But just to let you know. Now, I mentioned before that one of the upsides of being a farmer is that you will always be fed, right? You may never get rich, but you'll always be fed. And your book mentions the idea of cash crops. Cash crops are exactly what they sound like, right? They're a crop that you're not growing for food, but specifically to sell, right? There's awesome things with that, and there's dangerous things with that. Now, the upside of planting cash crops is I might make more income. I can send my kids to school. I can get them an education. I can help my community build a clinic. I can do all of these things, right? The downside of a cash crop is if it doesn't work out, you can't eat it. And a great example of this is coffee, right? As you can see from this chart, right, coffee prices have fluctuated radically over the last 40, 45 years, anywhere from, less than 50 cents to $3.50, right? That is a huge range that you do not see in other commodities, right? So what ends up happening is that when you see these coffee prices going up, more and more people will plant coffee. Now, you may not realize this, but from plant to first harvest is about 5 years on coffee. And so what ends up happening is as the prices are going up, more and more people start planting coffee, and they see the prices continuing to go up until finally they've gotten this 5-year window done, and then suddenly there's a glut on the market and there's too much coffee, right? And the prices sort of drop, Now, why am I bringing this up? Besides talking about some of the issues associated with cash crop, this is also, as I said, where you're starting to see the ways in which we are rethinking our approach to agriculture. So some of you might be familiar with something called fair trade coffee. And fair trade coffee is the idea that, farmers are taking all of the risk when it comes to this, right? That, you're going to grow this substance that I want you to grow, that I want to buy. But if international market forces beyond your control shift against you, this might mean that your family starves, right? And so more and more companies are stepping in and saying, listen, yes, I want you to grow coffee, and if you do, I promise you we will pay you $2 a pound, right? Even if the market drops to 50 cents, we'll pay you $2 a pound for it. And a lot of companies feel that that is a way that we can all share in the risk of agricultural production. And more consumers also feel that way and say, yeah, we need to take on some of that shared burden. And if that means that, that pound of coffee at Publix is $1 more or $1.50 more, I don't mind paying that, drinking my morning brew and not feeling like I wonder if a farmer's family had to starve to bring me this, right? So there are some signs that we're starting to rethink some of these things. We're starting to rethink this through a whole host of things, from farmers markets to co-ops, to community-supported agriculture, to fair crops, or things like that. So some kind of interesting things are taking place with it. All right, well, that's it. Thank you guys so much. I hope you enjoyed it. I will see you soon.